Ready for a deep dive into a society that took democracy to a whole new level.
I am. Athenian democracy, right?
You got it. But this isn't just your typical everyone votes kind of democracy. We're talking about a system where everyday citizens were the government.
It's true, they were. We often hear direct democracy and think voting, right?
Right.
But Athens, they took it way further. Imagine citizens, like, directly shaping every single part of life.
Every part. Like, give me an example.
Declaring war. Or, and this is where it gets interesting, setting regulations, like actual regulations for ferry boat captains.
Ferry boat captains. Okay,
Yeah.
You've got my attention. To guide us through this, we've got Christopher W. Blackwell's Athenian Democracy, an overview.
Great source.
We'll uncover how this system really worked, all of its surprising, complexities,
Yeah.
and why it still matters all these centuries later.
And to really get it, we're focusing on the 4th century BCE, which was like, the peak, the golden age of Athenian democracy.
Athenian Democracy 2.0.
Yeah, you could call it that. This is where we find the system, all refined and established.
Okay, so Athenian Democracy, 4th century BCE. What's the first thing we need to understand?
One word, domos.
Domos. Okay.
It's more than a word, really. It's like the core idea of their whole system. It's like a 3-in-1 deal.
A 3-in-1, okay.
So demos could mean your local village, your district, but it also meant the people, like collectively with a capital P.
Right.
And here's the thing. It also referred to the assembly itself, the heart of their decision-making.
Wow. It wasn't a king or an emperor making the big calls. It was the domos.
Exactly.
The collective will,
Imagine decrees, official decrees, being issued with the phrase, "It seemed best to the domos."
That's power.
Talk about a mandate from the people, right?
Right. But it wasn't just like chaos, right? I mean, there was a structure to all of this.
Oh, totally. Think of Athenian democracy like a really well-designed building with 3 main pillars holding it all up.
Okay, I like that. 3 pillars. Let's break it down.
Pillar number 1, and some would say the most important, was the assembly, or in Greek, the ekklesia.
Ecclesia.
This was Athenian democracy, like in action. Every single citizen had the right to speak their mind and vote on proposals.
Every citizen. Wait, how many people are we talking about here?
We're talking about 40,000 people, sometimes even more, gathered together on the Phoenix Hill, out in the open, debating, everything from war and peace
Wow.
to, you guessed it, those ferry boat regulations.
Okay, that's a lot of voices. 40,000 people in one place, all trying to make themselves heard. How did they ever get anything done?
That's where our second pillar comes in, the Council of 500, the Boule.
Okay, the Boule, what do they do?
These were the folks working like nonstop behind the scenes. Think of them as the project managers of democracy.
500 project managers. That seems like a lot, even for the Athenians.
It does, doesn't it? But here's the really fascinating part. They were chosen by lot, 50 citizens from each of the 10 Athenian tribes, and they only served for 1 year.
So it's like this constant rotation of power.
Exactly. They were really, really, keen on making sure that no one person, no group held on to power for too long.
I can only imagine the range of perspectives and experiences that must have brought to the table. That's amazing.
It really is. And it shows how deeply they believed in giving power to, the average citizen. But they didn't stop there. Remember we were talking about checks and balances before?
Right.
Well, they had a third pillar for that too, the People's Court, the Heliaia.
So even after you finished your year in the council, the demos, the people, could still hold you accountable for what you did.
Oh, absolutely. This court was where juries of everyday citizens judged their peers, which included officials, even after their term ended.
Wow.
And to make sure that these juries were impartial, they had a whole system for selecting jurors randomly, plus super strict anti-bribery measures. They really took this stuff seriously.
They thought of everything. It's like they were really aware of the potential pitfalls of, giving so much power to the people.
They were realists in a way.
Yeah.
Although those weren't the only players in the game.
Oh.
We've also got the Areopagus.
Oh, right.
The Areopagus, this ancient council, shrouded in, gravitas. We'll have to get into them later.
Okay, so before we get to them, let's rewind a bit. Let's go back to Athenian lawmaking for a second. Because I have a feeling it wasn't as simple as like one vote, up or down, and that was it.
You're right, it wasn't. Athenian lawmaking, it was more like a marathon than a sprint. They had laws called nomoi, which were, their constitution, like the bedrock of their society.
Right.
And then they had decrees called Cephismata, which were more like day-to-day decisions on specific issues.
So decrees were more like, the quicker, more flexible option.
Yeah, exactly. But here's where it gets interesting. Changing the actual laws, the nomoi. Now, that was a whole other story.
It sounds like it. How do they do that? Change something as, fundamental as a nomos.
Picture this. A citizen, right? Just a regular citizen, proposes a change to a law.
Okay.
And then that proposal, it's like put on public display for everyone to see
Yes.
and debate for weeks, almost like a trial for the law itself.
A trial for a law. Okay, I like that. So who delivered the verdict in this legal showdown?
A massive panel of everyday citizens. They were called the nomothete.
The nomothete. So not like elected officials or anything.
Nope, just ordinary Athenians entrusted with shaping the very laws that, govern them. And if a politician tried to, bypass this whole nomoi trial thing,
Yeah.
let's just say there were consequences. Blackwell actually gives an example, right? This politician who tried to sidestep the process ended up in court himself.
Wow. Talk about accountability.
They were serious about protecting the integrity of their laws.
It makes you realize, even with direct democracy, they knew they needed safeguards. Speaking of safeguards, we've got to talk about this Areopagus you mentioned.
Yes, the Areopagus.
What made them such a big deal?
Think of them as, the Supreme Court, but maybe even, more serious,
Okay, how so?
Well, first off, they met on the Hill of Ares,
Okay.
which was this place, steeped in history and, gravitas,
Right.
And they handled, only the most serious matters, homicide cases, impiety, corruption, even, and this is kind of wild, cases where someone, chopped down a sacred olive tree.
Okay, hold on. Sacred olive trees, what's the deal with that? Were they just really into their landscaping back then?
It was more than just landscaping. Olive trees, they were, essential to the Athenians economically, symbolically. To cut one down, especially a sacred one, that was, a major offense.
I see. So not something you want to see on your record if you're trying to impress the Areopagus.
Exactly. So to be a member, you had to have already served as an archon.
Which was?
One of the highest officials in the city, a prerequisite almost, to prove you could handle the big stuff.
So like Athenian finishing school for future council members?
Something like that. But even then, that wasn't enough. After your time as an archon, you went through this, intense public audit.
Oh, wow.
Your entire time in office, everything you did, scrutinized by your fellow citizens. Talk about pressure.
That's a lot of pressure.
Yeah.
But I guess that's what it took to earn a lifetime membership in this, super exclusive council.
Exactly. They were committed to experience integrity and, making sure that justice was served by the most, qualified hands possible.
It really is amazing. You
Yeah.
know, this system, as radical and, direct as it was, also had all these mechanisms to make sure it didn't, go off the rails. They were really thinking ahead.
They were. They weren't naive. They understood that power, even in the hands of the people, had to be, carefully managed. And this is something that becomes even more, poignant maybe, as we start to look at the things that led to Athenian democracy's decline.
Yeah, like a shadow falling over this vibrant system they had built. And I'm guessing a certain Macedonian king named Philip had something to do with that shadow.
He did. The rise of Philip II of Macedon, back in mid-4th century BCE, that was a real turning point for Athens. It's a story of, shifting alliances and ambition and the slow erosion of Athenian independence.
It's interesting, though. It wasn't like an overnight thing. It wasn't like they were just conquered in one fell swoop. What were some of the early signs that things were changing? That Athenian democracy was, under threat?
It was subtle at first. Philip, he starts expanding his influence in northern Greece, forging alliances, right?
Right.
And, gradually moving in on Athenian territory and interests. He was a really smart strategist.
Was he?
Oh, yeah. He knew how to exploit divisions. He understood that a united Greece could, really hold him back.
A classic case of divide and conquer.
Exactly. Divide and conquer.
So did the Athenians, see this coming at all? Were there people speaking out against this growing, Macedonian threat?
There were. Blackwell talks about this Athenian orator, Demosthenes. He was a huge critic of Philip, gave these fiery speeches, now known as the Philippics,
Whoa, okay.
warning everyone about the danger Philip posed.
So did anybody listen?
Some did, but others, they thought that maybe accommodation was the best way to go. Like they thought, Athens had been through a lot, right?
Yeah.
The Peloponnesian War, internal struggles. They
Yeah.
thought maybe they could negotiate, hold on to at least some of their independence.
So it was like a city divided, some people wanting to fight, some wanting to find a compromise.
Exactly. And you can just imagine, right, the debates in the assembly, all those voices on the Pnyx arguing over what to do. It was a defining moment for Athenian democracy, a real test of their values,
Mm.
you know?
It's like, this perfect storm brewing. They're facing this external threat, but then internally, they're divided on how to handle it.
It's a tough spot to be in. And Philip, he was smart enough to use that to his advantage.
Right.
He kind of like positioned himself as this, I don't know, as the savior of Greece,
Right.
while at the same time, tightening his grip on everything.
And that's where the Battle of Kyrene comes in, right?
Yeah.
338 BCE.
Yeah.
That was the turning point, right? The moment when any hope of, finding a peaceful solution just vanished.
Yeah, Chaeronea was a crushing defeat for Athens, their allies too. Philip's army, they were just, too strong, too well-trained. It marked the end, really, of Athenian dominance in Greece.
So what happened next? Did Athenian democracy, just crumble overnight?
It was more of a gradual thing. See, Philip, he was smart. He didn't want to, completely alienate the Athenians. He knew they were still a force to be reckoned with, culturally, strategically. So he created this thing called the League of Corinth.
The League of Corinth. That sounds almost friendly, like some kind of, regional cooperation initiative or something.
Yeah, that was the idea, yeah. A pan-Hellenic alliance to fight against their common enemy, Persia. But really, it was Philip's way of, consolidating his power, with him calling the shots, of course.
So Athens, this, proud, independent city, was now just another player in Philip's game. How did they react to that, losing so much of their autonomy?
It was a bitter pill to swallow, for sure. Imagine the conversations, the sense of loss, but also maybe a sense of resignation, too. I mean, they'd lost the war.
Right.
They weren't in a position to argue.
So they made the best of a bad situation.
Pretty much. And then Philip dies unexpectedly.
Right.
323 BCE.
Okay.
And his son, Alexander the Great, takes over.
Ah, yes. Alexander.
And there's this, flicker of hope, right? Maybe this new guy, maybe he'll be different, more sympathetic to the Athenian cause.
But knowing how this story ends, I'm guessing that wasn't the case.
No. Alexander, he was focused on bigger things, literally conquering the Persian Empire.
So while he was off doing that, how did he make sure the Athenians didn't, get any ideas about rebelling?
He left his general, Antipater, in charge.
Antipater.
And let's just say, he wasn't known for being, lenient.
Right. I bet that got the message across.
Oh, yeah. And then, in 324 BCE, Alexander, he issues this decree. It's known as the Exiles Decree. And it really showed how much control he had over Athens.
What did the decree say?
Basically, he ordered all the Greek cities to readmit their exiles.
All of them.
All of them. And that included political exiles, people who had been, ostracized, banished from Athens.
Wow. He wasn't messing around. This wasn't about, some border dispute. This was about Alexander asserting his dominance over the very heart of Athenian society.
Exactly. He even announced that he was going to take away their control of Samos, this island they had ruled for, centuries.
So much for a fresh start with Alexander. How did the Athenian assembly take it?
What do you think? They were furious. But what could they do? Rebellion was suicide. But giving in, just like that, it felt like betraying everything they stood for.
It's like this impossible choice, Damned if you do, damned if you don't.
And that, in a nutshell, is how Athenian democracy started to fade. It was slow, it was painful.
Yeah.
But the spirit of it, the idea that the demos, the people, should have a say in how they're governed, that never really went away.
It's a powerful story. And, in a lot of ways, it still feels incredibly relevant today.
Oh, absolutely. It reminds us that democracy, it's not something you can just take for granted. It takes work. It takes vigilance. It takes a willingness to, stand up and fight for what you believe in, even and maybe especially when it's hard.
Something to think about. From the rise of Athenian democracy to its eventual fall, we've seen how power can shift, how even the most successful systems can be vulnerable. But most importantly, we've been reminded that the choices we make, the actions we take, they matter. And that the fight for freedom, for a government that truly represents the will of the people, that fight is never truly over. It's a fight that continues to this day in different ways, different places. And it's a fight that demands our attention, our participation, and our unwavering commitment to the ideals of democracy.